I'm Savia Shaukat. I welcome to all of you in the second episode of the webinar for the month of February. This episode is based on finding opportunities in the online instructional challenges from COVID-19. Dear audience, I hope you will respect the protocol of the webinar. Please use the chat box for your questions and the comments, or you can directly talk with the speaker. This webinar is being recorded and presented through live stream that you can find through the sources of social media of University of Education, Lahore. I'm delighted to introduce you with Dr. Radhika Force. Very warm welcome, Dr. Radhika. Dr. Radhika is a full professor of education and director of the Advanced Professional Teacher Development and International Education in the College of Education and Human Development in George Mason University, United States of America. Dr. Radhika is an active researcher with over 100 publications and a co-authored book and over 200 scholarly presentation and teacher professional development workshops conducted in national and international context. With a focus on social justice, equity, and access to education, her research center on educator professional development and critical reflection, second language acquisition research in global setting, and international mindedness. She has been recognized by French government and awarded prestigious awards for her service in education in France, and she was honored in 2010 by her university with the Mason Excellence in Teaching Award. Dr. Radhika has held several international grants and directed multiple international teacher education professional development programs. Dear audience, Dr. Radhika's session will address that COVID-19 has called all of us to rethink long-term assumptions that we may have held, challenge our belief about instruction and so many parts of our lives, and ultimately make significant change in nearly all aspects of our lives. The toll on human lives has been overwhelming, and we create has held several international special crimes and messages that have emerged from this aspects of our lives that call us to change, call us to re-examine many aspects of educational practice that have long been in need of update, one being in educational practice. These calls for changes have included educational updates to include greater equity and access instructional practices that are inclusive at all levels, more interactive learning in classroom and in online remote spaces. Dr. Radhika's session is about finding opportunities in the online instructional challenges from COVID-19, and let's talk over it. Thank you so much, and over to you, Dr. Radhika.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sadia. I do appreciate that lovely invitation, and welcome to all of you. Assalamu alaikum. It is so nice to be with you virtually this evening for us and this morning for you. We are most grateful to be able to share some quality time together, and I want to help you to begin to think with me about some new ways of teaching and learning in our online spaces and in our face-to-face modes after things open up more post-pandemic. So I'm wondering, Dr. Sadia, if my PowerPoint, if we might begin the PowerPoint now?
Yeah, can you see? Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, I can. Thank you so much. I do appreciate that. Okay, thank you. So I've entitled my talk Seizing Opportunities from the Challenges of COVID-19 because we have all been living, it is nearly a year for us here in the United States, and I suppose about the same for all of you. When travel came to a rapid halt last year, when we all, at least here in the States, moved into our homes and worked from home, we were called to pivot, which is the term we use, into online spaces. And that was an enormous challenge for all of us. As we finished the spring and moved into summer, there was greater comfort in that online space, and yet there still remained some challenges, right? And in the fall, we went through the fall semester, exercising all of the new things that we learned, and yet lingering in some of these spaces because we realized the seriousness that this pandemic has placed in front of all of us. So I use that as my launching pad for our time together today. And if you would like to move to the second slide. Thank you so much. So I think about our opening challenge and the topic that we're going to be exploring, and I call you to explore with me. It's had COVID-19 and our ensuing time online and all of the challenges that this pandemic has placed. It's had such an impact on us, on our students, on our society. It has changed the world in so many ways, but we are beginning to also look at this as a call to action and a time to look at some of the lessons that we've learned and begin to look towards some opportunities that might arise when we all return to our classrooms. And I don't think, this is my personal opinion, that things will be exactly the same as when we all began to sequester in our online spaces last March. But I think there might be some good things that can come of this in our teaching and learning processes and in society's look at equity and access to education. So my question for us today and our opening challenge is, how might we seize some opportunities from this very dark space and from the challenges that so many people have faced? And I am not at all downplaying those challenges, I know. But we need to change, and perhaps this has created a forum for us to examine some of those changes. You wouldn't mind advancing for me? Thank you so much. So, if we do rise to the challenge, there might be a silver lining that we can find somewhere that's yet to be explored. I think this is a time for planting seeds of some new thinking and promoting some of the educational change that I'm sure you all have already thought about in many ways. Some change in ourselves as educators and faculty members, in our program's coursework, in our faculty's communities of practice. Perhaps we will unsilo and begin to have greater communication across our programs. In the context of this new time, I think we will probably have a time, it's an excuse if you will, to explore new ways for faculty and students to grow together. So if we can begin to create a time or a forum for genuine learner engagement, while we look at interactive strategies that support learning, both in our face-to-face environment and online or in hybrid delivery, in thinking about online learning and teaching to enhance the success of our students. There are ways that we can tap into some of our new learning to really understand families' needs and to understand our own faculty engagement and outreach with one another, and across our university, out of our departments, and working with colleagues in new ways. Expanded research, there is a wealth of research that awaits us that is related to student engagement, related to our own response to COVID-19, related to all sorts of outcomes from COVID-19. This research is ripe for publication. And certainly for all of us around the world, there should be new policy considerations that address greater equity and access for all of our learners. And I know that's the case there. It is certainly the case here in the United States. So we can hold hands across the world in our fervent wishes for change. So I want you to go back to a year ago and think of yourselves at that point. And I'm just going to talk you through sort of these three little pictures that I have on your screen. When March of 2020 hit, how was your emergency lift into the online space or your pivot to remote instruction? I think of my hopeful idea would be that it would be graceful, like this ballerina on the left side of your screen. Did you just float into this online space? I'm smiling and chuckling to myself because my guess would be that unless your specialization is online teaching and learning and you've done it for a very long time, it was probably not easy to be graceful as you plopped into this online space. Were you like that tightrope walker that's in the middle of your screen and you teetered a little bit to the left and the right? Did you feel as if you had a safety net that you could fall into? Maybe, maybe not, right? We'll be talking about some of those safety nets that we might have for one another a little bit later on in our talk. Were you like this raft going down whitewater rafting, flying down a gorge, and you got to the end and you thought, yay, we made it? I don't know. I'm just wondering what your image might be like. Next slide, please. So, whatever your experience was, we are all educators and learners, and there is always more to do. There are a few opportunities that our research has already started to reveal for us in several studies that have been done. And some of the opportunities that are coming out of this very dark area are that faculty are gaining new skills. They're reporting greater creativity that is enabling them to focus on their learners in synchronous and asynchronous delivery. So if I use any terminology that we use in the States that you all don't use, please feel free to ask me what I mean. And Dr. Sadia, please feel also free to stop me and say we might need a confirmation of my use of terminology. Okay, I'm very comfortable with that because I can't see your faces, so I can't use attendee feedback in order to answer. So I'll rely on my colleague there, Dr. Sadia, to give me a stop if I need to.
Yeah, sure, I will do that.
Okay. Our students, interestingly, some of our quiet students are finding voice in this online space. They're exercising more learner engagement as the faculty members offer it to them, right? It's a two-way street. There is more learner autonomy, and there's been a lot of self-efficacy and more reflective learning because learners are doing a lot more writing for communication. Faculty and students are engaging in learning together. And there's been a lot of goal setting and a lot of objectives that are shared at the beginning of class that perhaps we don't do as much or as obviously in the face-to-face space. There's a lot of room for growth there, I think. There are enhanced instructional practices. We have been working so hard to infuse our teaching with new tools and new strategies. I know at George Mason, we have had multiple opportunities for professional learning, and I go to my technology specialists all the time. I'm in about 3 or 4 critical friends groups, and we help one another and enhance and give critique. It's been an amazing learning for me personally as a faculty member and as a researcher. There's been a greater attention paid, not just at the university level, but at the K-12 level and in policymakers and advocacy for systemic racism and social injustices. And I'm sure you all know from the news that what we have been facing in the U.S., this is not unique to us. It has its own context, but social injustice is something that is very present around the world. And I think COVID-19 has pulled this to the forefront for us. And it's giving us a chance to perhaps confront some of these old practices and advocate for new. And to that end, there is a greater world focus. I think we're all paying attention to what is going on, not only in our local space, but in the global, and how the global informs our local. Next, please. So I'm going to ask you to ponder, what might these emergent research findings mean for us as faculty members? Should I be looking for my instruction to simply return to the way things were before? I hope your answer is no, because that's the space we're going to be exploring. What might these emergent research findings mean for students at the University of Education? Might they mean for education in general? And might they mean for you as faculty members there at UE? Okay, thank you. So let's take a look and we'll consider. My next slide, please. Okay. So consider that, before these challenges and despite the challenges, university faculty and K-12 educators are now coming together. They're coming to think about and enact some educational practices post-COVID-19. And I think our lenses, the way that we look at instruction, the way we see our students, those ways are going to be enhanced. We're going to see things through different lenses because things are never going to be the way they were. So what might some of these enhanced lenses look like? Well, research is certainly showing that there is reported greater faculty and learner engagement. And when I use the term engagement, I mean that as a two-way street. So it's been quite necessary in our online space. This research is also telling us that there's greater learner engagement through interactive feedback with our students, through avenues and personal connections. So there are new ways that we're connecting with students. And in our online spaces, we really are having a chance to consider some questions we've never thought of before. So what will you do in the future? Well, take a moment to take out those genuine lenses of yours. Think about your classes and think about yourself as in a self-study mode. And think about how you've engaged in student feedback up until this point, or maybe before COVID. So, let's see, we'll go back one. So was your instruction a little bit like this street sign in New York City that shows street signs going in every direction that says one way and the other one is one way? And then in your picture to the right, there is a stop sign. And at that stop sign, you could go in either direction, but if you go straight ahead, there's a wall in front of you. So we certainly don't want any student engagement to be like that, but I'm sure there have been situations for all of us where some of that may have happened. And this is part of our own pathway toward realism and greater understanding. So let's look at our next slide. And so remaining in our self-study mode, our genuine questioning, how about that two-way communication street? What does that look like for you? Do you see those cars going in two directions? But there's a yellow solid line, which for us in the United States means you don't cross that line. So we can say there's two-way communication, but does perhaps a mode of two-way communication where you don't intersect, is that what we want with our students? I don't think so. So let's go to the next one. Remaining in our self-study mode. So what ways does this depiction look different from the other forms of instructional feedback that you saw on those two preceding slides? Well, I see a traffic circle, and in that traffic circle, I see that red car and that blue car, and they're coming in from different spaces. They could meet up with one another. They could go around in a circle, and if they go out one pathway and it's the wrong one, they could do a U-turn and come back in and try another pathway. They could even parallel and be side by side for a while going around that circle. They could exit together, or they could exit at different spaces. This is what student engagement hopefully could look like. We've seen that this type of interaction can give us greater connections, greater student engagement. Students get excited to be able to share their own ideas. They do show greater motivation, much more enthusiasm about what they're learning. And in this type of circular communication mode, continuous feedback, communication and conversations can be spontaneous and yet guided. So it's not a free-for-all. There is order and organization, but there is fluidity at the same time for exit and entrance. Okay, next slide, Dr. Sadia. So what might be some new ideas to support some change that I would like to see? So emerging COVID research tells us that educators are telling us, they're reporting to us with some enhancements that they are actually seeing and experiencing more thoughtful student engagement during some synchronous instruction, which means that even if you're online, you are conducting your class in real time with your students. They're also seeing, and I didn't put it on the slide, but they're also seeing a whole lot more thoughtful engagement from students in asynchronous discussions and in asynchronous work with one another and with professors. So let's kind of take a look at a few tools that might be interesting for you to try and engage in a great experiment yourselves. Next slide, please. So, if I use the term synchronous classes, Dr. Sadia, is that something that everyone is on board with? Does everyone understand synchronous online instruction?
Yeah, I think they do.
Okay, good. Because I know terminology, especially terminology across the world, we're speaking the same language, thankfully to you that you all speak English, but for me, but terminology can be very different. But when we do, and at our university, as well as in our K-12 schools, there's a combination of synchronous class learning and asynchronous or on your own learning. And that combination has proven to be quite successful. So in synchronous classes, what we do to engage students really does set the tone for whether they stick with us and whether they are going to be interactive in their learning. So some of the things that we do are that we use our chat functions quite frequently. And I'm not sure what learning management system you use. We often use Zoom. We also use another one called Blackboard. Sometimes we use Google Classrooms. But this chat function seems to be a common function among many of the platforms. And I would encourage you to use that. You can ask an essential question at the outset of class. You can circle back to it at the end and call students to bring their ideas together. So sometimes at the beginning of class, I will ask students to put in the chat box 3 words or 10 words. I'll give them a very short thing that captures something they're thinking about that addresses what they read for class. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the flipped classroom a little bit later, but I always have my students read ahead of time what I'm going to be working on in class. That is part of their job as students, and part of my job as being a faculty member is to give them a prelude to what we're going to be doing. I give them guiding questions. I post my PowerPoint and my lesson guide in advance so that when I am in a synchronous class that's only an hour, or it might be an hour and 30 minutes, I can use every minute that I have those students there. So that chat function gets them in right away, and they can tell me what they're thinking about. Now, if they haven't read, I can circle back with them later and say, I happened to notice that you didn't have anything to say in the chat. Did you have problems with reading? Was there something that didn't make sense to you? That's all right. Make an appointment. I'm available. My office hours are on Tuesdays, or you can make another appointment. Let's get you going so in the next class you'll have something to put in that chat function. So it really gets them going, it pulls them all in, but I also have to notice what I'm seeing. I also like to post my objectives at the beginning of class. What do we want to accomplish during this class? What are my goals for you? And then at the end of class, I want to capture my students' closing thoughts also in that chat box. Sometimes I might ask, what was the most important thing to you that we talked about today? And in Zoom and in Blackboard, I can do an entire copy-paste of the chat function, and I can paste it into a Word document, and I go back later and look and see who posted, who had questions. I can then go back and answer those questions. I can also see what the most important things were to them that we talked about in class, that can sometimes be a surprise, because it can happen that what I think is the most important thing may not be what they think was the most important thing. That's a learning moment for me. And I also invite them to ask questions at the end. So sometimes I ask them to either send me a message, send me a 2-line email of a question you have at the end of class, or something similar. I always keep it very short because otherwise they won't do it, right? Okay, so there are also ways to engage in student collaboration in class. So I don't know if your platforms allow for breakout rooms or not, but I often put students in line in maybe 4-person or 5-person breakout rooms, and I have questions for them to engage in. They need to have a recorder and someone who leads the discussion. I put the timer on and I tell them how long they will have, and I give them a 1-minute warning before the end of the breakout room, telling them I'm going to pull everyone back into the main room in 1 minute, so draw your thoughts to a close. When we get back to the main room, we have students report out. Sometimes that they have looked at different questions and examined them and talked about them. Sometimes they look at the same questions. I get those same recorders to take notes and post them for their classmates. So that's a great way to keep them engaged, because they have to be talking and discussing in order to come up with the ideas to share with their colleagues. There are a couple of other tools that are really fun for students to use, and in the accompanying Word file that I sent to Dr. Sadia, all of the links to these are there for you. So you have both the PowerPoint, I believe, and those should be active links. And there's also a Word document that you can access. So these are just really important ways to keep students on focus, so they're not off somewhere shopping or off somewhere doing something else on their computers. We want 100% of their attention. So I would also say that it's so important, and I do this face-to-face as well, but particularly in this time of such isolation, to start each class with some sort of personal connection or check-in. How are you doing? What is your situation? Are there any special needs that you want your colleagues or me to know about? You don't have to say it out loud. You're welcome to send me a personal chat message if you need something extra from me. That personal connection and care can mean so very much, well, to all of us. So those are just some initial thoughts. Let's go to the next slide, Dr. Sadia. So there's some other online tools, and I'm going to again refer to that document that I sent to you. But just to remember that teachers to students and students to teachers do equal a continuous feedback loop. So when you all help yourselves think and be creative, think about how you can enhance that two-way interacting process to provide continuous feedback. So some other new tools that our teachers in the U.S. are using, and there are ways to, when we are not in synchronous sessions, but we are asynchronous, that we can use our own time to make a quick recording and send it to our students. So Screencastify is one program that we use a lot in the US, and these are free, by the way. And Loom is another one. And I like those a lot because when students are doing their work, that time frame might be very different from the time frame in which I work. Students work at all hours of the day and night. But if we just tell them, after you read this, tell me what this means to you, they can then not worry so much about writing everything down, but they can give you a 2-minute check-in. So this combo of video and messaging can support communication between and among teachers and students, and we think that's really important. Flipgrid is another really neat program that can capture and bring together all kinds of student feedback and student ideas and put it all on one screen and bring it together. So I invite you to just play around with some of these, and I'm going to talk a little bit in a little bit about some ways that you all as faculty might just sort of partner up and try some of these things out, because on our own it takes too long to do this. But if we share and try some things out with our students and share the positive things and some of the challenges, that it helps us all. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So one thing I also believe in very firmly is the notion of formative assessment. We all know there's a lot of summative assessment that's required of students, but getting to success in summative assessments is largely connected to formative assessment practices that lead to students' mastery of material. And so there's some nice little things that you might be able to incorporate yourself that you can try these out and see what it's like. So our K-12 teachers and now our university teachers are using an approach that's called glows and grows. And by starting, I don't know if you've ever heard those terms or not, but by starting out by telling a student after you've read a paper, these are the things that I really liked that you said or that you talked about or that you addressed. Tell the student what he or she has done well. And then there are some additional things that would strengthen your work. These are the things I would like for you to do as you prepare your next draft to send to me or to share with a student colleague. So that tells a student, hey, this is what I've done well. This is the next step that I need to take. And there might be several iterations of glows and grows to get students from where they are to a final product. And I ask them to keep all their versions because I want them to see what this incremental set of drafts does for them in leading to a final paper or in leading to final mastery of a particular topic. Another way to think of it is these are the accomplished areas. Hey, you have nailed this. This is very good. This part needs more attention. And then students know what to go after. I think that's purposeful feedback that engages students in sort of a call for response. So at the end of this needs more attention or the grows part, if you then say, please send back your questions and your next draft, they have to get back to you. It's not, oh gosh, I made all of these mistakes, and tosses it out the window. Okay, so you want to keep them engaged with you. It also, by providing a consistency of formative assessment, it really calls on them. It puts the onus of learning on them. They have to come back to you with their next draft. And so due dates, time frames are very important to help them with timelines. So you're not the only one who can provide feedback. And so it's very wonderful to set up student pairs, student work, or groups of students, small groups, maybe a trio of students, to read and respond. I always have a rubric that I am scoring that I use to score student papers, and I ask students to pretend they are me, and they are looking for those elements in what they're reading. I also ask students to reflect on their learning. What were their difficulties? What were the things that went easily for them? Where do they think their next focus is going to be? And finally, student goal setting. At the beginning of a course or at the beginning of a new unit of work, to help them look at what they would like to learn, what they need to know, and then at the end, how well did I do that? Why did this go well, and maybe why did that not go so well? That type of accountability is very important, but it does pull students into their own learning process, students of any age. And so we share these processes with teachers. They try them out and see how that looks, but we use these as well in our university classrooms. Next slide, please. So this concept of a flipped classroom, I think it is even more meaningful in our online world. I always have students read in advance of what I'm going to talk about, because then they come to class with some knowledge of what we are going to be doing. They know they come with questions, or they come with some knowledge, and they know already what they've grasped and what they need to grasp. Their learning is much more natural that way. And so I would encourage you to, as a faculty, explore some ways that you can engage in this flipped classroom. And there are lots of different ways that people use the flipped classroom, but I use it just in the preparation and the forward reading. And oftentimes I will record something if it's an asynchronous class, but I get them ready for synchronous work using this flipped approach. Next slide, please. Okay, so another thing is you can't just spring this on your students without telling them what you're doing. So to bring your students into your new instructional approaches, you really have to tell them what you're doing and why it's so important. Because without engaged students, learning just doesn't achieve this full circular potential. So when we think about what we wish for our instructional approaches, we think about equity and access to learning. What do I need to provide? What do students need to come with? I need to think about the learning differences among my students. Which ones do I need to draw out? Which ones are my always talkative ones? But I need to give time for those who are shyer, who don't speak up in class. So how can I bring them in as well? I need to think about unique learner characteristics. None of this changes in my online space, but I think I have time to think about it more purposefully. student culture and faculty culture, something very interesting to talk about. What do students say about learning? What is their approach to learning? What are our assumptions that I make about teaching and learning, about students' connections to learning? I think it's also important to think about the importance of student voice and to listening to our students and trying out new tools. Listen to what students say. They'll let you know if they really enjoy a certain approach or if they find something rather ho-hum. Once they get a little bit more comfortable with this interactive approach, they will be happy to share with you what was meaningful to them, and you'll know by their own engagement. And so that involves you taking what we call an inquiry stance. That's where you stand there and think to yourself, what is the result of my teaching? As a result of my new approaches, as a result of my preparation for class and what I am doing, what are my students' responses? And so taking an inquiry stance and sharing some of that with one another is a very important aspect of this interactive learning process. Next slide, please. So, we've also learned from COVID that this is a time that's a call for action. And we have several calls for action. You know, in the States, we are particularly paying attention to systemic racism, social injustices that have lasted for far too long. And we've also focused in on, which is music to my heart because I believe so strongly in international mindedness, but the importance of international perspectives. So the racially related occurrences that took place this past summer in the United States have really been a call to action for all of us. We have self-divided into working groups, and we're reading a lot of anti-racist literature and looking at ways that we can make changes to our courses and into the tenets of equity and access. It's a wonderful journey, and I feel as if we probably will never end this journey, but that's a good thing because we need to continue to address these injustices and find solutions. I do think that COVID has given us a call to purposeful action that involves change. And stepping up to the plate, as we say, we need to be thinking about what those changes might be and why. So changes in our course readings, changes in our programs, changes in our recruitment for many diverse teachers to join our teaching force. We need multiple voices and multiple people to provide these perspectives that we so need. I think that the systemic racism that certainly has been surfaced in the U.S. is giving us not just a pause for examination, but a call to do something about what has been far too long unexamined. And so confronting our own racial biases and our own assumptions, the importance of these international perspectives that I talked about, these are our calls to action, at least at Mason and in many, many universities in the U.S. So what are our next steps? I'm sure I've given you lots of thought, food for thought. So Dr. Sadia, we're on to our next slide. So, wow, lots of information. What do I do? So, what are some ways that you might begin to think about, talk about, examine some of the things we've talked about today? Well, I think it's wonderful and actually very important to establish faculty buddies, or just small affinity groups, we sometimes call them in the States. So these small working groups can try out or test some of the tools and approaches. You can talk about student responses to some new practices. You can discuss in groups that continue beyond today to activate some new thinking and some new ways of being in your classroom. I think you should make plans to meet again with some ideas that you can report out to one another. I think this is very important. What went well? What did I learn? What did my students learn as a result of whatever you might be trying out? What might make something better next time? I firmly believe that divide and conquer is the way to go. So that's not to say that everyone has to try everything, but I would try one thing at a time. Form a dialogue group. Examine some of the things together. And I think it's important to lay out an action plan to see what some of the bigger goals might be that you would want to accomplish. Your next slide, please, Dr. Sadia. So if we're thinking about achieving some change or augmenting our practice, achieving change is certainly active and ongoing, and it's a journey. And like this crazy network of roads on your screen, it seems to never end, but that's exciting too, because I think as educators, there is so much to look for, and there is so much change that's needed in the world that our learners are our next generation. Next slide, please. So your journey starts now. And I hope this will give you a few items as food for thought. And my final slide is the next one, Dr. Sadia. So I want to thank you for just being such an amazing and engaged audience. I do realize you're all muted, so that's another possibility for the online space, right? I try not to talk as much as I've talked today. But I do want to give most sincere thanks to Dr. Sadia for organizing all of this, and to your Faculty of Education for their generosity in inviting me. There is the Word file that I mentioned to you, and Dr. Sadia has that. And I want you to feel free to use any and all of these resources. You all will have my email. There it is, and Dr. Sadia has it. So please feel free to contact me or to tell me about your successes. I would love to hear about the things that you've tried. And when we return to greater face-to-face instruction, I really want you to think about the ways that your knowledge and your understanding about the teaching and learning process may have changed as a result of this time that we have all been pulled away from what we love so much, being in our classrooms with our students. But maybe transferring some of that into the online space and sharing what students love, which is technology. Thank you. So I am all finished, and I would just invite whoever has any questions to pose them.
Yeah, thank you so much for your wonderful and productive session. Dear audience, now it's a time for question answer. If you have any question, please let me know. You can write it in the chat box, or you can directly talk with the speaker. Oh, wow, we have some in the chat box.
Okay, so I need to find out where my chat box is on here. I see a whiteboard option. Where would okay, I think at the top. Is it at the top? Yes, I see. Okay. So, okay, so a certain sense of boredom. So, I'm just going to say that there are never any questions that aren't important. And so we do have students that sometimes have a sense of boredom. So a certain sense of boredom creeps into online classes. That's really stressful. And how do we deal with that? So I'm wondering if there are any thoughts from our attendees as to how to answer that question. I can see a really nice way to pair up with somebody who might want to examine a little bit of that question with you. Anyone want to take a stab?
Dear audience, Would you like to respond to this question?
I just invite any of you. I'm a very interactive teacher, so I always call on people to feel free to offer ideas.
Yeah.
It's all right also to be shy. So what I hope in answer to that question is that perhaps you would have a look at the Word document that I sent, and also it's really hard to have so much information presented at one time. So maybe to think of some of these interactive strategies and try one or two of them out. Talk with your students, tell them what you're going to do, and see if that engages them a little bit more. So I would ease into that and maybe have what I call a critical friend, someone I can talk to and say, hey, this went well, or that really bombed, it didn't go so well. What should I have done differently? Because we have to open ourselves up. Not one of us is perfect. And so when we want to make a change, we just have to go after it.
Yeah, and I usually recall the names of the students and then I call them one by one. This does work. Yeah, and in that way we can really engage all students in the online discussion and we can take all students on board as well. Well, dear audience, do you have any question? Otherwise, I have a couple of questions from Dr. Rabika.
So I'd like to just make one observation, or I do have a question for you, and you all, I know for bandwidth purposes, it's always difficult to always have video on, but do you find in your classes that your students have their video on or that they have their video off, and what is your situation with that?
Well, the video is usually off because sometimes they just complain they have a weak reception and the broadband is very poor, and sometimes they say they are so shy and they don't want to, see us during online learning. They don't want to watch us. So they have different type of the concerns and the reservations since this is a new concept. Mm-hmm. So just fighting with the online learning. Yeah.
Okay. If there's any way for students to have their video on, I think it's much more engaging because I can see expressions. I can see whether students are with me or not with me. I can see if they're raising their hand, and I know there's a little hand raising mechanism on our screen, but I also ask my students to just raise their hands, their actual hands, so that I can then call on them. So there are lots of things if their bandwidth supports it. So it might be something that is a little bit of a developed culture and something that you may need to try out a little bit. But I think that is a challenge. And I do realize that you certainly have offloading of power and things like that, particularly in the summer. So that's something I do get.
Yeah. Dr. Rabika, what is getting missed and becoming a major challenge in education system in terms of students learning during online and the distance learning mode and style?
What is getting missed?
No.
Well, there are many things that are getting missed. For us in the United States, some of our greatest challenges for reaching students are for our students with special needs and for our students who, for us, are English learners. And so our language classes, our English support classes are extremely challenging. We have worked in very small groups with them, but those are some of our greatest challenges. I think students who have situations at home where young learners are called on to be independent learners can be very challenging if that child is not engaged in what's going on in the classroom. It's particularly challenging in the online space, and most particularly if there isn't any visual acquisition of that student, right? So again, that's something that hopefully policymakers can work on a little bit, and we recognize that for sure.
Yeah. Okay. From the research point of view and the funding options, what is the biggest challenge in terms of conducting research and securing funding opportunities during this pandemic?
So for us at the university, our funding streams have continued forward. So if we have grants, we've continued forward with them by and large. Implementation grants, so things that called us to travel or to particularly to other countries, or even to be in schools, have had to take a pause during the pandemic because we have not been allowed in schools. So that part has been rather challenging. On the other hand, our funders have been very generous in allowing us to pause and extend. So no cost extensions have been good. Now, on the positive side of funding, there has been a call, a large call, as a matter of fact, in the United States to do research in education during COVID, or to do research in the online domain so that research provides evidence for future funding. So looking at student learning, looking at student, when I say student, I mean K-12 student learning, looking at university student learning. There's been a great deal of research on wellness and on wellness challenges during the pandemic. So those aspects, so perhaps joining with colleagues in other departments or in other units of the university, such as in psychology or in other areas, could be very lucrative for us in education.
Yeah. Okay. So what do you think how human relations, particularly the students' mutual relationship with the peers, are being affected due to this pandemic, and how we can overcome and how we can create the social platform for them online?
That's a great question, and this is something we've been looking at a lot at our university. So we have, for example, made a regular practice of bringing together some of our advisees in joint conversations for virtual tea or coffee chat, as we call it. So I have an open coffee chat time every week with the faculty in my division. And sometimes people come and sometimes they don't. Sometimes one person comes, sometimes 5 people come. It depends, but I have it at the same time. And I did ask them if they wanted me to change the time, and they said, no, it's better to leave it the same time. And then if I can come, I will. If I can't, I won't. But I try to open up those avenues. I have some doctoral students who are working on their dissertations, and I do just virtual connections with them where I put them online to chat. So I create a Zoom room for them, and we get online and they have questions. So it's good that they can interact with one another and not only turn to me for answers, because I don't have them all.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Rabika. On behalf of University of Education, thank you so much for accepting my invitation and conducting a terrific and productive session. Thank you so much for engaging us through your presentation and sharing information about the ways to engage students into our classroom during the online learning. And thank you for sharing and creative and doable ways to face the challenge of teaching and learning as a result of this pandemic. Thank you once again, and I'm looking forward to meeting you in a future webinar sessions later months of this year as well. So,
wonderful. Well, I hope when this pandemic is over that I will get back to Lahore. I love Lahore. So that will be my 6th trip there if I get back. So that will be a wonderful, wonderful time. And you know, Pakistan is an amazing country. So you all have so many things that are amazing to share with the world.
yeah, it is. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Rabika. I can share your PowerPoint and your supporting document to the audience, to the faculty members. And if they have any question, then I can put it for you through email. So
that's wonderful.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. All right. Have a wonderful day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.